Going back to that diagram, you'll notice that 4 out of the 6 domains in K5 have something to do with number and operations. Counting in cardinality in kindergarten, number and operations in base 10, operations in algebraic thinking, K through 5, and the fractions domain, in grades 3 through 5. And what's more, many of the standards in the measurement and data domain or in the geometry domain explicitly support the focus in the number and operations domains. An example of this being that when you learn about area, that explicitly supports in grade 3, that's sort of tied naturally, and by design I should say, to the grade 3 multiplication standard in number and operations in base 10. So this means that there's less in the K5 curriculum of patterns, there's less of work with data than people were used to seeing, and a lot of commenters were unhappy with that. So, why go through the pain? Well, there is a payoff for achieving focus. And I think probably implementing a focused curriculum is going to be the hardest thing for this country to do. Because we're so used, I think, sometimes I think what we have is a sort of like an eat dessert first mentality in mathematics education, where every wonderful topic, should go into kindergarten or whatever, 3rd grade, 4th grade. You say, here's this really fantastic topic. Kids can get really into this. It turns them on. They can get excited by it. Let's put it into the curriculum. And the things that we took out of the standards were all wonderful things. It's not like we hate data. It's not like we hate patterns. Well, a little bit. Anyway, depends how they're implemented. But still, you can't have everything. And so you do have to decide what the vegetables are you're going to eat before you eat dessert. So it'll be a difficult shift. In high school, I would say that the focus is not so much reducing the number of topics as integrating them under overarching principles and habits of mind. So that, for example, when students are learning trig identities, or when they're learning how to manipulate quadratic expressions, they're not learning a gazillion different techniques that all seem disconnected, but they're trying to see some structure in the expressions that enables them to see them all as part of one understanding. Let me say a little bit about coherence. So that's focus. And as I say, I think if we just achieve that in some measure, I think we will have made progress. What do I mean by coherence? Achieving coherence means following some sort of natural pathways through the subject. It means making the subject make sense as a story. I mean, you want kids to come out of their mathematics education not feeling that they were just subjected to a blast of stuff every year, which is sort of blew past them, and then some of it got caught, some of it didn't. But that there was a story. That there's a reason I'm learning what I'm learning in grade 3 because this thing happens in grade 4. And not only the students, but you want the teachers to know what the story is. You want them to see a progression where things are building on each other, where you're moving from one thing to the next, where you're sort of slowly painting out a picture of a subject which has structure and beauty and all the things that we love about it. Because I know that everybody in this room loves mathematics. The difficulty with that is that there are at least 2 different principles you can try to follow. One is what you might call the natural logic of the subject, the things that follow logically from each other. But there's another important part of a progression of learning, which is how students naturally learn things, what sequence they naturally put things together in. Those 2 don't always agree. That's an unfortunate factor in mathematics education. It's what makes it so difficult. So there was a certain amount of craft that went into just trying to reconcile those 2 stories. And you have to sort of, you have to try and take advantage of the wisdom and practice of the field often to make decisions about those sorts of things. My favorite, I'm sure everybody has seen this picture before, but anyway, my favorite way of explaining what I mean by coherence is to look at this Grecian urn. It's got structure, it's got a story. There's a frieze of people going to a sacrifice around the side there, but it's also got little fine details on the rim. It's got these beautiful handles. So it's a work of art about which you could look at and tell a story. You could try and describe it to somebody. When we write standards for a subject, we break it into lots of little pieces. So this jigsaw puzzle, in some sense, is equivalent to the original urn. That is, you could put the pieces back together again and see the picture. But you can't see the picture in the pieces. Just staring at that puzzle, that's the whole point about a jigsaw puzzle. You can't see the picture. Well, when you write a bulleted list of standards, what are you doing? You're breaking it into, this thing you're describing into pieces. The standards are the pieces. And so there's an inevitable sort of damaging effect to the structure of the subject that you get by trying to break it into pieces. On the other hand, you have to do that. If you, within the sort of, I mean, maybe you don't have to if you live in a perfect world in a paradise where there are no school boards and there's no accountability and so on. But I mean, if you live in the real world, that's what people want. That's what our bosses, CCSS or MGA, were asking us to do. They're asking us to write state standards. And this, on the right, that's what state standards look like. Not because states are horrible or anybody's horrible, but that's what happens when you try and bullet something out. So when we wrote the standards, we did try and break with a few traditions of standards writing in order to try and restore some of the structure. Part of that I've already showed you. The arrangement into domains was intended to show sort of some structural features of the subject so that that glance at the K8 diagram gives you some broad view of how it all fits together. The arrangement into clusters and then standards was also intended to give a sense of flow and a grain size at which you could view the standards and get a sense of the story. You can look at the standards just by looking at the cluster headings. It's easier to read. It gives you a sort of view of each grade level, and in fact, the front page of each grade is just the cluster headings. It gives you a way of how things fit together. You can say things in the cluster headings that you can't say in the individual standards. The other thing we did was break with the tradition of equal grain size. So you notice that jigsaw puzzle, all the pieces have the same size. And that's a dearly held principle of standards writing for assessment writers. People who have to write assessments for standards, what they would prefer to do, understandably, is just take each standard and write 5 items for that standard. Well, that doesn't work if some standards are huge and some standards are small. It doesn't work if some standards are more important than others. And here's an example where in the cluster called Understand Place Value in grade 2 Number and Operations, the first standard is huge. It's basically about understanding place value for 3-digit numbers. It wants students to understand that a 3-digit number represents amounts of hundreds, tens, and ones. There are some specific points. 100 can be thought of as a bundle of 10. You want that understanding to be in there. You want them to understand that naming these numbers 200, 300, 400 is referring to 200s, 300s, 400s. So there's a whole bunch of understandings of place value built into that standard. That's a foundational standard for many, many grades to come. That's a foundational piece of understanding that if students don't get in grade 3, they're in trouble. But look at the next standard, count within 1,000, skip count by 5s, 10s, and 100s. That's a very discrete performance that once you can do it, you can do it. It's not saying anything more than it's saying. It's important. You want kids to be able to do it. It's probably not fatal if they don't get, if they can't, at least not if they can't right away. So there's completely different size to those two standards. Mathematics doesn't come in pieces of equal grain size. Ideas don't come in equal sizes. And so some are small and some are big, and the standards try and reflect that. But that does put a strain on assessment writing, because assessment writers have to start thinking more